All right. Good morning, Dad.
Good morning.
Today is Friday, February 13th. And before we get started, just a quick reminder, I did start a clips channel for 15 to 30-minute videos that are topic specific. I didn't want to spam this main channel with content that maybe you guys have already seen. So if you guys do like to see content-specific clips, look in the pinned comment below. Also, yeah, please like, subscribe, all that stuff. And you can subscribe to our Substack as well. It's a good way to get a debriefing of our episodes if you don't have time to read the whole hour. Okay, anyways, Dad, I've been kind of in sort of this pre-war anticipation for a while.
Right.
But I don't want to rehash the same type of conversations, like when is this going to happen and what do you think? So first, I'll just start. Is there anything breaking here that we need to be aware of? Or are we still just, another armada is on its way, supposedly?
Right.
I don't know.
I guess the two main points, the two new developments are, first of all, the meeting in the White House between Netanyahu and Trump and their respective teams. The way it sounded, if you look at Trump's Truth Social post and comments that Netanyahu made, prior to flying back to Tel Aviv, it sounds like, again, we have to emphasize that, or, they're giving the impression that Netanyahu attempted to persuade Trump to, attack sooner rather than later, and to abandon the negotiations, and Trump insisted on continuing the negotiations. But we know it could be a ruse. We've seen that happen before, right? So we really don't know. But, quite possibly that's what's going on. For all reasons that we've given before, there are many reasons for Trump to be reluctant to do this. And I think he's realizing that there are people who are telling him, in spite of all the tremendous pressure there on him from members of his administration, people in the media, and so on and so forth, donors. There are also people that are telling him the truth that, hey, this could really hurt you. And we know that Trump is allergic to real wars. He's a bully that wants to go in and give somebody a sucker punch and then proclaim himself the king of the playground or something and march off. But he doesn't want to get into a real fight. I think that's clear. And, so we maybe see something like we saw in Venezuela, where he's there for a long time trying to figure something out. But I don't think he will be able to figure something out. But my fear is, okay, two things. First of all, okay, the negotiations are gone, but I don't think that they're going to succeed, again, for reasons that we've given before. Again, the lack of trust on the side of the Iranians, they're going to demand more. But then also just the incompetence on the side of the Americans. They're just, we see they've made a mess of the Russian negotiations. So again, Putin and them are livid over this. It's just that they thought they had an agreement back in Anchorage, and the Americans have just walked everything back, and they just don't seem to be able to speak with one voice or hold to one position. And we're talking about very, very complex negotiations. I just don't think they're capable of hammering together an agreement. A team led by Witkoff and Kushner, with Trump above them, I just don't think they can do it. So there's that problem. And then just eventually, there's always going to be this pressure, and that somebody is eventually going to convince Trump, oh, we got this formula that'll work, and he'll go for it, and then we'll have a mess on our hands. I think that that's what's going to happen. So anyway, that's really my assessment of that part. Okay, the other thing is that there was an order issued by Trump for another carrier fleet to prepare to deploy. Now, it's important to say it's prepare. The issue to deploy hasn't been, or rather the order to deploy has not been issued yet, according to my understanding, at least the latest news that I've seen. So that is the George H.W. Bush carrier and its fleet. And I think they're actually on the East Coast here in the U.S., and it would take them about 2 weeks once the order, to deploy is issued. So if that happens, then that's just more pressure for a war to begin, right? I mean, the more that Trump puts on the line, the more difficult it becomes for him to back down. So let's hope that doesn't happen. But it looks like there's a very good chance that it could.
Right. He's probably being told you have to put more on the line to pressure the negotiations to
Yeah.
force a deal. But then the flip side of that coin is that now you're truly committed. You can't. It's hard to pull out, right? Once you have
Right.
that many, and just more likelihood that something will go wrong. It's like, well, we have them in place. We got to use them, right?
Yeah. Right. Well, I think, that's probably the strategy of people around him, that, they see that he's reluctant, but they're crafty and they know how to work with him. And, finally, they're kind of playing chess against him. Eventually, it's going to be checkmate, where he just has no way to back down and he has to do it. That's my fear. I think that's what's going to happen.
Frame it in his mind that we're doing this to help you with the negotiations to get that deal to look strong. Yeah. But really, the ultimate goal is like, okay, once all the pieces are in place for the war to launch an attack, we'll just say, look, the Iranians are just being so unreasonable. They won't surrender. So we have to attack them now.
Yeah,
pretty much. Okay, well, I was thinking about today maybe taking a step back and kind of looking at the bigger picture, because I'm getting too just in the weeds and just scrolling on my phone looking for Iran war news and this Epstein stuff. And I'm just like, this isn't healthy. Maybe what we should do is kind of think about the bigger picture. What's this war is likely going to happen, and we're going to have to deal with the fallout, and we'll analyze it and break it down when it does, and if there's any big developments, obviously. But we often are just talking about the big picture of the collapse of the American empire, and we often describe it as the U.S. is flailing. The hegemon is lashing out because it's trying to preserve its status and its protection. I'm just wondering, when we look at history, whether it's Rome, the British Empire, Soviet Union, is this a pattern that we see in empire collapses, that they traditionally go through this type of flailing period, and that this is something that, and in a sense, it's a normal process. It just feels very abnormal to me.
Yeah, I don't think so. I don't think you can find, I should know the history better, but I can't think of anything to parallel this, let's say, with the British Empire, or even with the Roman. Maybe all I can think of is actually the Athenians and the Peloponnesian War. It was they were beginning to lose. It became clear, and they kind of engaged in increasingly reckless and bullying actions, and it eventually led to their demise. That's going way, way back. 2000, roughly 2,300 years ago, but. I guess, one thing that I was struck by, if we want to look at the larger picture in the historical context, I've been reading and coming to the end of this very, masterful biography of Stalin. And because it's a biography of Stalin, it's also history, because he was so much a part of history. It's called Waiting for Hitler by Stephen Kotkin, and I highly recommend it. Anyway, I'm coming to the end of it, where the attack, Operation Barbarossa by the Germans, is just on the horizon, and the Russians, the Soviets, are aware of this, and I've also just read about, of course, the famous non-aggression pact between the Soviet Union and Nazi Germany. That really marks the beginning of the Second World War. Now, in recent there's been a recent revisionist effort to reframe that. In general, it's been understood like, okay, it was the Nazis, they were the expansionists, they were the ones who really launched the war. But now there's an effort, because of this hatred of Russia, to assign equal blame to the Soviet Union. Like it was these two great totalitarian powers. They had something in common, and they decided to work together. And that's really, I think, a very false understanding of history. It was clear, actually, it had become clear through the 1930s that Hitler was a very dangerous man. Now, I don't want to. I know there are many, many differences between, the situation now and the 1930s. And I often, Hitler is overused as an example. But I think there is a parallel here that we can discuss, and that is useful. He was very reckless, and he made these, and clearly had, let's say, an expansionist intent. He made these, he was he made these threats, and it began to alarm his threats and claims on territory that it began to alarm, the other powers of Europe. There's no question about it. And they reacted in different ways, but, the most famous, of course, is the British Neville Chamberlain. And he chose this policy of appeasement, which in the end, the French went along with it too, and other powers. It's just like, okay, well, let's give him a little bit of what he wants, try to work it out, and then everything will calm down, right? And that's what they would do. It happened most famously in Czechoslovakia, but there were other incidents as well. And it happened again and again. And, Hitler would take what was offered to him, and then he would start to demand more, and he would break agreements. That became obvious. But there was a real reluctance on the part of, especially Neville Chamberlain, but other European leaders, to forcefully, to put their foot down and say, no, this is it. If you do this, it means war, or we push back. And you can understand, I think Neville Chamberlain is given a bad rap because remember, this was only 20 years after the previous war that had resulted in the deaths of tens of millions. There's a whole generation of British young men that was in large part just wiped out. And you say, we don't want to do this again. We really want to avoid this, right? And that's certainly the French are thinking the same way. Now, it became increasingly clear that Hitler was a menace, to Europe. And so the Soviets were looking around trying to find somebody, hoping that they could actually make a pact with the French and the British against Hitler. But it never worked out, say, okay. And then he became fearful that actually maybe Hitler would make a pact with the British and the French, and there were talks going on like that. And then he would be the vulnerable one, and, the Nazis would take him out. And so that's what led to the non-aggression pact. But, what I guess the parallel that I want to make, that I want to draw out of this, is just that today it's the U.S. that is, behaving very recklessly and very aggressively around the world, and is demanding things, and the agreements are made, and then the U.S. tears them up and pushes harder, and demands even more, and. I don't need to go into the details of all these things that we've talked about, from Iran, Russia, Venezuela, whatever it is, we see it around the world. And you see a general tendency, I think, among, the opposing powers, let's say especially Russia, and until perhaps very recently Iran, and then in China to a great extent, though China has shown more resolve, at least when it comes to economic conflict. It's just really, again, a policy of appeasement. They just say, okay, let's, what they did was outrageous. We have a right to respond in this way, with equal force. But we don't want to start World War III. Again, it's the way Neville Chamberlain thought, which is, again, it's not an irrational way to think. But what happens is that, the hegemon just keeps on, in this case, it's a hegemon. You couldn't call the Germans a hegemon, but the reckless, aggressive power finds that it can, first of all, pick off, weaker countries like Venezuela, because other countries don't stand up for it. And nobody is willing to really confront it. If you're the bully in the playground, to stop and when you throw a punch, to throw a punch back of equal force, but, to try to calm things down and just hope the whole problem goes away. But the problem actually stays there and it becomes bigger and bigger. So I think there is something similar there. I'm thinking particularly of the Russians. Recently, we had that assassination attempt, and they're still in negotiations. Assassination attempt, we know of the number 2 man of the lead negotiator. And the Russians have made a decision, and it is, I want to emphasize, it's not irrational. I think they know that what's going on, they know that it's phony, but they say, well, we just appease them, humor them a little bit, and we do get these benefits. We get, maybe no escalation, a continued decrease in support for the Ukrainians. Those are tangible benefits that we've got from maintaining some kind of relationship with this bully. But at the same time, the bully seems to never learn, and it's always, now he's off the coast of Iran. And Iran, you say this is a story again. They tried appeasement again and again and again, and this is where they are. I think Iran is kind of like it's been sort of, I think I described them as really the pioneer of the multipolar world. They were the first ones to go out there, and maybe they're the pioneer again. You can use that term, or they're they're at the leading edge of it. They tried the appeasement and everything as far as they could, and now they have no choice. And so maybe the fight begins with them. But that's scary. Again, we're talking about there's always really a potential for World War III. And I think, again, that explains why both the Russians and the Chinese are treading so cautiously. Like, I'm surprised that the Chinese haven't responded forcefully, for example, to that tanker that was seized in the Indian Ocean. Apparently it was taking oil to China. But, they clearly are concerned. They have to be. They must be alarmed. But, nobody, again, wants to be responsible for starting a world war. So how are they going to deal with it? Well, we'll see. Maybe it's all going to play out in Iran. One thing is, like, the Chinese apparently have some very, very sophisticated reconnaissance, intelligence gathering ships there in the Arabian Sea, not far from the American fleet. And it's, why are they there? I'm sure they're, monitoring signals, and they're in a position to, immediately notify the Iranians if attack is underway. That's just one example. I hope, and it seems to be the case, that, this time, the Iranians themselves understand that this is existential and that they need help and that they are receiving help. And let's just hope, hope against hope. That, okay, this is something where the bully finally gets a bloody nose and maybe he stops bullying. We hope that. Many people, many historians have argued that that's what could have happened in Europe if at an earlier stage, like all the powers had got together and said no, because Germany was weaker, like in the mid-30s, and if there had been a united front, Hitler probably really would have backed down. He wasn't a man. He had this vision, of course, that we all know, but he understood power, and if they had demonstrated real resolve and united fronts against him, maybe the Second World War would never have happened. And I think again, there are more differences than similarities, but the parallels are there. There is a bully. There is a very aggressive and powerful country, that other countries, other great powers are just trying to appease, and I think without effect.
Yeah, well, one of the big differences, though, is that Germany was on the rise at this time. It was kind of regaining its footing and building up its military and everything. The United States, I started this question by asking about what happens to these declining powers. Like the U.S. is in decline, but it's acting this way. I mean, it seems like the risks are, one, there is a rapid rise and also rapid decline. Think that's when hubris starts to build up on the when your country's doing well and it's kind of found a new sense, a new identity, kind of like the beginning of the Third Reich, and then for the United States, it's kind of the opposite. It's like, things aren't going good. We got to just make sure we do everything to preserve what we have.
Yeah. That's right. That's an important difference. And I think it's not just that the U.S. is in decline, and I think much of its behavior can be explained in the way that you just explained it. But also, Hitler did have a vision. He wanted Lebensraum. He wanted to carve out this huge, expand the German Empire into Eastern Europe. And that was there in his writings, and people who were really paying attention, were aware of that. I think there was sort of a lot of wishful thinking among leaders. Is like, let's just talk. But there was, there really was that intention, that thought. He had a strategic vision, one thing that, and he was a very intelligent man. Trump, on the other hand, I don't think he has any strategic vision. It's just sort of like it's megalomania. It's kind of about, he's thinking about golden statues raised to himself for doing incredible things. But, his incredible things are things that look good on TV. So it is different in that sense, but it still is very, very, it's very dangerous. I'm like this tanker war, as I pointed out, that this is something, he also understands the money directly. So he just, wow, we just grab their tankers and we sell the oil and it's our money. That's, that can, maybe the plan is not actually to, gain territory or, well, to some extent it is to subjugate other countries, because it is a bowling tack and the countries are faced with a choice. Do we submit or do we fight back? And he'd like to see other countries submit, including the great powers, to acknowledge him as number one. Again, so there are very great differences there. I admit.
Yeah, well, it sounds like this flailing, this lashing out that we use to describe the United States, it seems to be, other than you said, like the Peloponnesians, right, way back. Then it sounds to be a uniquely self-destructive thing here in the United States. Then, why do you think?
Yeah, I'm sure. Right now I just can't think of something similar. I just think of the decline of the Roman Empire. There was a general retreat. I don't think there was actually sort of as it grew weaker, they drew back. They withdrew from Britain. They began to realize that they couldn't defend those distant borders. They didn't make a push into new regions as they grew weaker. That was certainly the case. And then, the British, they tried to hang on, but they didn't try to hang on to their empire that hard. They realized when they had lost the power to rule over it, they let go. The Dutch, they retired from power, you could say, very graciously. So I really can't see, there must be something, all I can think of is, I read Thucydides, the Peloponnesian Wars, and I remember seeing the parallels, some similarities in the way that the Athenians acted. They seemed like as they were actually their position, they were at their peak, but beginning to decline. And I think they began to sense that and they began to act very, very recklessly and very, very aggressively. And that's the only parallel that I can see.
Yeah, what's scary as well is just that this is the first time that we've had a hegemon with nuclear weapons and there are multiple nuclear weapons. So it's just when you have the ability to end the world, it just makes you think that that's your ultimate insurance card, right? No matter what, hey, we're always on top, or else, that's the one, I think, real different factor with the decline of this empire as opposed to other empires. If other empires had the ability to destroy the world, they might have already done it.
Yeah, no, it's true. It does. That's always there in the background.
Right. And another thing, this is another kind of a macro, bigger question, is just that, I mentioned in the last conversation we had that the world is starting to view the United States, not just the United States, the West in general, not so much as just a political or economic or military rival, but as something that's actually evil or maybe satanic. That there's a spiritual sickness in the West, I think is what's being perceived by a lot of the world. And do empires usually rot from the inside like this? Is this like this corruption with Epstein? Is it just a symptom of a civilization that's lost its soul? And if we are being viewed as this evil satanic force we're ruled by an evil satanic force, can a civilization ever recover from that? Like if this is how, it ends and people just view us, burning effigies of Baal that symbolize the West and Israel, and it feels fitting, that's the thing.
Yeah, well, there's a real rot at the top. I think there's no question about it throughout the collective West. And, even prior to Epstein, I know Patriarch Kirill of Russia kind of used some of that language, as the Iranians have used for a long time. So, yeah, it is turning. I think Putin in contrast, is very, very careful not to do that. He tries to stay very, very cool, and it tones down the rhetoric as much as he can. We say Medvedev, he's something different. He'll get into that, and but that language there, that discourse does exist in places like Russia and certainly Iran, and in China, I'd have to think about that exactly. What they're not going to use spiritual language. Well, they will, even though they're officially an atheist state. They will still kind of talk about a spiritual sickness. Yeah, I just haven't been following it that closely there in China, but I can say it's certainly true within Russia and Iran. That they and I think it's something that the rest of the world is starting to pick up upon, and dissidents within the collective West too. I mean, there's an increasing sense that the people that rule over us are demented. They're depraved. I think they really are. You can use different kinds of language to describe them. Now, again, like the Kremlin, led by Putin, is very careful not to use that kind of language. So occasionally, maybe something slips out, but in general, it tries to, they try to tone down the rhetoric. Certainly Putin does, very much so, and you can understand why. We want to avoid World War III. We're winning this war, and we're not actually, whatever you may say about Putin, it's not like he's actually sacrificed anything, in military terms. And clearly, for example, the air war has been ratcheting up, and now the whole power grid in Ukraine is just, virtually almost entirely shut down now. And he hasn't held back, in spite of the criticism. So it's a case of, speaking softly and carrying a big stick. But the thing is, like, at some point, if you maybe, I understand wanting to avoid the rhetoric, but at some point, you have to speak clearly and really denounce your enemy. It's not just to maybe rally forces around the world or to your side, but even within your country, so people understand what this fight is about. And I think we're seeing the beginnings of that, and that may be part of when we finally do have a big civilizational conflict, which could be World War III, that kind of rhetoric will come to the fore.
Yeah, but I'm just thinking about the rhetoric in our own country. When we hear these things, I think many people in the U.S. are like, when they see us burning a statue, or people in Tehran burning a statue of Baal, people are like, we should be doing that here in the United States. Like this is a problem, right? Like nobody, we agree that there's something demonic happening here. And just if we're going to a war, the first job, of course, of these countries before a war is it's the propaganda. It's how do we dehumanize the other side to make people feel comfortable killing the other side. Yeah. And so they all do whatever they can to just do a black and white good versus evil. We're the good guys and those are the bad guys, and you just got to kill them. That's just how it has to be. But what we have here is just like, how can we make ourselves seem to be the good guy? I think that is a huge problem that the West has, that our our so-called elites have, right? These evil people that rule us. I don't think they can convince us that there's somehow you need to fight for us, that somehow we are the good force. And because there's just so many people, I think, especially young men, we all want to be on the force of righteousness. There's this drive in this sort of to be like, I want to fight for goodness. It just feels like you have a purpose to do the right thing. Mm-hmm. And I think it's so rare in history that we have a situation where it's actually pretty clear who's the good guy and who is the bad guy. Where is actual evil? Like the concept of defeating evil just goes back throughout history. It's just something that's ingrained into us. And I think especially as young men, to go out and conquer evil. That is a rallying cry. And it's just so many people are seeing the evil now. And the evil is the head of the Western countries, the Western elite. So they're doomed if they can't change that image. And I don't think they can. We've been seeing what's happening with the Epstein fallout. It's just getting worse and worse. It's over. And it's just a question of, how crazy will they get? Will they start dropping nukes? Will they start throwing people in jail? Will they start arresting people from speaking out? And we were already seeing the beginnings of this. So anyways, that's what I'm saying. It's just scary. It's like we always want a good versus evil battle, and now we have it, and it just sucks that we live in the countries where we're ruled by the evil.
Right. Well, of course, some of that rhetoric still works, especially against Iran. There are a lot of people in this country that think that, this is just a wicked regime, the Iranian regime. It's irredeemable. It just must be destroyed. There are a lot of people that have fallen for, but I think you're right. So, enough so that if, for example, our fleet launched these decapitation strikes and killed the leader, whatever, there are a lot of people in this country who think, yay, we did a great thing. But if it goes beyond that, am I actually going to fight and die for this country? I think that the answer that so many people in the West, especially young men, will give is no. And that's the thing, is that they can, okay, well, we can have these special operations like, abduction of Maduro or whatever, and they'll get a lot of applause. And people like Nicholas Fuentes, little savages like him will applaud and say, this is great, man. But if it goes to actually you going out there and, and fighting a years-long war, how many people would be willing to do that for the leadership in the West? And I think that it's just not there. It's just not there. There's enough disillusionment, a real that we really don't have the ability. I hope actually to wage a long-term war. And, you see it. I mean, I think that's, again, what like the polls show, and certainly, especially in Europe, more so than in the U.S. It's just that in places like Germany, overwhelmingly the answer is no, I'm not going to even if my country's attacked, I'm not going to defend it. I mean, what does that tell you?
Right. Well, it just sucks that the evil has nuclear weapons. So it just changes the calculus
also,
of things.
They do have very powerful conventional weapons and can do a great deal of damage and can bully little countries. Again, Venezuela was just very weak and has been bullied into submission. I think that's clear. Again, Iran is that, like I think I said earlier, is that kind of dangerous middle case. It's not a great power, but it is. But it is a power. It's a regional power, and it does have the ability to really inflict harm on our forces and our bases. And it's in that gray area, where the bully he has to think twice about it, but he still might be able to convince himself or be convinced by his buddies that he can win a quick fight. But then he may find out that he was wrong, and then we could be in real trouble. And I think that's, this is the great danger that we're faced with.
Okay. All right. Well, let's try to.
Again, if it, like I was just saying, because of what you were just pointing out, that's the big problem. Okay, these raised special operations, it's made for TV, and unfortunately most people like it. I don't think in the end it's like going to save the Republican Party in the midterms, but but you get some applause. There's maybe a very slight bump in the polls. I don't think it's going to be long lasting. But then if it goes south, then you find out you're in real trouble. It's not just that your arsenals are depleted, which they are, but that your own people are not really committed to this. Yeah, they will, if you keep it on TV, and the gas prices don't shoot up and you don't start talking about conscription, they're okay with it. But the instance it goes beyond that and becomes real, then you find, the administration, or any Western government is going to be in real trouble.
Okay. All right. Well, let's think about this then. If the multipolar world is inevitable, as long as the world doesn't blow up, so I shouldn't say it's inevitable, because that is actually a distinct possibility that we might end up blowing up the world in a nuclear world war,
Right.
But let's say we make it, and then 50 years from now, the multipolar world is fully established. The U.S. dollar is no longer the reserve currency. What is this a golden age of cooperation, Or do you think that we descend into chaos? I mean, because this is the argument that the hegemon will try to make, is that, we need to preserve, we keep the peace, the stability.
Right. It's the Pax Americana argument. It's just that, if we rule the whole world, then we don't have these internecine conflicts. We can maintain a peace. Now, but the problem is the Pax Americana argument has obviously failed. You look at just all the conflicts over the last 25, 30 years, and almost all of them are caused, by the U.S., unnecessary wars.
It's the cost of peace.
In the name. Yeah. So it just doesn't work. It's clear, it's this insistence on ruling the world and insisting that other countries, simply, bend their knee and conform to the American way. That is creating conflict. It's driving conflict around the world. I would say the multipolar world is inevitable. It is happening. It's already, it's happening before our eyes. It's not some distant dream. It's just the trend. It's reality. And we have to be realistic. I don't think we ever can speak of a golden age, on this planet, ever since the fall, to use, biblical terms. It is a fallen world, and it's not that conflict is going to disappear. But it can be managed. That's the thing, and again, it's real. It's just what is happening, and we have to accept it. The insistence on the hegemon, is his insistence on maintaining unipolarity is, what is driving conflict, because it's unrealistic, and you have to be realistic. You have to be a realist and live with the world as it is. And that's, it doesn't mean that there's not going to be conflict, there's not going to be competition, but you can manage it. So, that's the world that we can hope for. It's not going to be a golden age. It's not going to be a perfect world. But it could be, in the end, a world where many of us prosper, and where, different civilizations are allowed to pursue their own visions. The understanding is that it's okay. Yeah. If, Iran, okay, you have the Islamic Republic, that's not us, but you pursue your own vision and try to realize your dreams in your own country. And, China and so on, every country is able to, again, follow its own path. And that in itself, I think, is a good thing, right? It's the end of this, again, end of history sort of moment, this effort to impose a single ideology on the whole world. And I think, again, it's a really nihilistic ideology, that in itself, aside from the problem of creating conflict, is a bad thing. And it would just be good. This would be a nightmare that the world can wake up from, and we can become different peoples can, again, pursue their own ways of life. And that would, without fear of being attacked by this hegemon, or constantly pressured by NGOs and whatever. That would be a good thing. And then it would be good for the U.S., as we pointed out. It would just, shed these burdens of empire, shed this ridiculous insistence on, why do we have to send fleets to the other side of the world and risk these terrible wars that are going to cost us a lot in both blood and treasure? We actually look at the U.S. above all is probably, has the least to worry in a truly multipolar world. We have this dominant position on the North American continent. We have, oceans on both sides. There's really, what are we afraid of, that the Mexicans are going to invade us? It's just not going to happen. And we could prosper again and just shed those burdens, all those costs, all that money that is thrown, into the MIC, and that actually weakens our, that draws away all that talent that could be focusing on creating better products and making life better for all of us. We can prosper, we can, and so many different ways in a multipolar world.
Yeah, when I think about the multipolar world, it's so appealing because we have the current U.S. hegemon in its current state, and I think that ironically the presence of the U.S. hegemon is actually kind of binding the world together, against it. And so you're having these friendships being formed. I mean, you think about how, India and China are, forging their friendship, bearing the axe on things. I mean, just having Russia, India, and China all there next to each other on the same continent, very different ethnic makeup, very different religious makeup, but they are showing this intense cooperation that I think is very encouraging. But part of me thinks is like, well, maybe once the hegemon is gone, do we go back to squabbling? Because it's almost like we have the hegemon to make everybody like, we got to get together. It's clear they're eating babies and they're they're praying to Satan, whatever it is. These are clearly the bad guys. Doesn't matter what. I don't care about the other differences. We're friends now, and so that's what maybe a little concern I have is that.
Yeah, well, no, there's some truth to that. That's a good point. Again, as many people have pointed out, when the Cold War ended, and we didn't have, a common enemy. Well. Actually, we wanted to have one. The problem was actually like our MIC, and so on. Said, well, wait a second, like, what are we here for now? Or why is NATO here, right? So it could have been a chance to scale back and to become a normal country again. But we really needed that enemy, and I think we finally found it again. We resurrected it in Russia. But that common enemy. It is useful. It's something that when it's gone, your allies maybe cease to be allies and they become rivals in some extent. So there will be squabbles. There will be rivalries. There will be tensions. I think that's all true. I think all of those things could be managed. And one thing you have, I guess, in a multipolar world is that every country has a lot of options. It's not just, do I submit to the hegemon or not? And if I don't submit, will he attack me? Right? That's where we are now. It's just that smaller countries can foster ties with many different powers. And that's the wise course of action. So there actually is kind of an incentive. There is a potential for rivalry, for squabbles, for friction, and that will happen. But there is also a counterbalancing incentive to cooperate, as much as possible, to actually build up ties with as many different countries as you can. And that can, and that can prevent conflict. It really can. And I think that that's something to be hoped for. There's no, the thing is like when you have blocks or you have the choice, I'm with the hegemon against it, it's a constant, you can see the bind that small countries like Georgia are in. They actually don't want to make these choices, but they're being forced to. Or, Hungary, there's a chance, Hungary has tried to be independent, but it's just like the hegemon in the form of the EU is doing what it can to crush it. And it may end up crushing Hungary. Let's be honest, that's what may happen. But in a multipolar world, those countries like Hungary and Georgia, they can be independent. They really can, because these blocks don't exist. This, hegemonic power doesn't exist. There is a multipolar world in which they can establish strong ties with others. So like if one country starts to behave badly towards them, well, they can just kind of counter it by moving closer to these 2-3 other great powers. And that also, that disincentivizes that power that might want to behave hegemonically, from behaving in such a way. It's just like everybody has an incentive actually to make, their own system govern attractive, or actually to pursue some sort of diplomatic course that to avoid bullying, and to actually, make it clear to every country that, having a relationship with us is good. It's we can offer things and economically or whatever, that we have all these different exchanges. So there There can be, with multipolarity, yeah, there can be frictions, but there also can be sort of a competition I think inevitably there will be a competition to make each form of government as, appealing as possible.
Well, it
It
sounds
becomes
great.
clear, like, yeah, I mean, right, because if you can't, this is the thing. It's like, because we have with hegemony, this temptation is just to use brute force. I have the power to do that. And there was one time when we really did. And I think we're losing that, but we're still we're relying on that sense that we can just bully them into doing that. But when that is lost, then that bullying, that incentive to, or temptation to be a bully goes away. And that's one reason, again, to be hopeful about a multipolar world.
How do we ensure that a multipolar world stays as a multipolar world? I mean, how do you said, these blocks don't form, the hegemon, but why wouldn't they form later? Is there anything that keeps them? Is there any mechanism that ensures that we can kind of have this more peaceful cooperation, and you can choose which your trading partners are, and you have more autonomy and freedom as a country?
Well, there's no way to ensure it. There's always something. Any system, we're not talking about a system of government, but as an international order can always be subverted, by one country or another. Now, it would have to be, I guess, the greatest danger now would be China, which is becoming, is looking like it will be the future,
Top dog.
great power, the greatest among the great powers because of its population and its manufacturing capability and its technological capabilities. The good news is that, well, first of all, China does not have a history of any kind of reckless expansionism. It just doesn't. And it, we don't see in this, like in the thinking of the Chinese elite now, that kind of the idea of global hegemony is just absent. Now, it doesn't mean that it can't come, it can't develop at some time in the future. Of course, it could. But one thing again is that that it is difficult. Like, even if China were to begin to pursue that course, China is very powerful, but it's still just what, is less than a fifth of the world's population,
Still
less
a
than
lot.
that. Yeah, sixth of the world's population. It's a lot, of course it is. But if it really does pursue that course, it still has, 5/6 of the world's population arrayed against it. If it's tempted to do that. And again, there's no reason to believe at the present time that it is. I mean, there is a great cost to pursuing that. It's really an unusual set of circumstances. It was World War II and then the Cold War and the collapse of the Soviet Union that created that unipolar moment. And I think maybe that's why, that's so unusual, that's not something that is going to be, that we can expect to happen again in any time in the foreseeable future, for centuries. It's a very, very unusual set of circumstances. And again, at the beginning, you're asking for a parallel, right? And it's really hard to find one. And I think it's because it's such an unusual set of circumstances that, that one country, it's never happened before, had such power vis-a-vis the rest of the world.
Yeah, and I mean, maybe things will be safer if China is clearly the dominant power in the multipolar world, just because of its history. That it's they always tout this 5,000-year history, and they haven't exhibited expansionist behavior. And I don't know why that is, and we should be grateful for that. Thank goodness. Yeah. And if they that's just something that's rooted in them culturally, then the world could be kind of safer, because it does make it kind of a pacifier. It's like, okay. And in a sense, China already is a bit of a pacifier to the United States. We saw what they did with the rare earth minerals, how that China really does have the United States in a vice. It can cripple the United States if it needs to. But why do you think that is, that China has never exhibited the expansionist behavior? And they talk about their 5,000-year history, but within the Western world, we just seem to have gone down a different civilizational path where it's just that we were always expansionists in the West. There are wars in China, I know, but there are constant wars. But there's the imperialism. That seemed to be
the wars within China, some that were very, very bloody. No
right.
question about it. I'll just venture one possible explanation is that okay, China has more or less held together since the Han Dynasty, which was established in approximately 250 BC. And so the main mission of any new dynasty was to reestablish control over the Chinese territory. And because the Chinese territory was so large and so varied, that was in itself, a huge challenge. So that was, that's been kind of the struggle of and the focus of the political elite within China for millennia now, ever since the Han Dynasty, is how do we hold things together? So they actually just didn't, you didn't really even have that extra either an incentive or a desire or a need or ability to go beyond that, because just holding China together was such an immense task. Again, it was such a huge land, so very populous, so, very geographically. And, even though we say everybody speaks Chinese there, in fact, linguistically and ethnically, there are many different kinds of Chinese. And just to rule over that land and to maintain a unified rule it took up all, their energy and their attention. So, towards the end, it became known as the Hermit Kingdom. They actually did conduct some explorations that went all the way to the east coast of Africa. But after that, they decided, no more, we're just staying here. And so they were a very, very sort of, an inward-looking society. There may be other reasons for that, but I think that, I think the explanation that I provided, you find it all the way back to the Romance of the Three Kingdoms that begins with, what is it that, what 合久必分，分久必合, which means, something that, is held together for a while is going to fall apart, but then something that has fallen apart will come back together. That has been sort of like the sort of the cyclical understanding of what China is about. And, that's the constant struggle, is trying to bring it back together and hold it together. We know that eventually it'll fall apart because there are always these centrifugal forces, but that again just militates directly against expansionism and global domination. They just want to have secure borders and they want to maintain control over their own territory. Now, in Europe, you had something very, very different. Europe was always divided ever since the fall of the Roman Empire. There was the effort to reestablish it. We had the Holy Roman Empire, but it was only partially successful. And in general, Europe was in a state of division. And now that actually gives it certain strengths because you have all these different countries competing against each other. And that's one reason, and it could turn into a military competition, which meant frequent warfare, but it also drove technology forward. And it's one reason, and I think that I know historians have argued, and I think correctly, that, Europe went far ahead of China in the last few hundred years, because part of it was just driven by this military competition. But with that, you do have these expansionist tendencies, these tendencies within, Europe to try to, for one country or another to establish a dominant position, that same spirit, can be applied overseas. And especially when, again, in the last few hundred years that Europe went so far beyond its competitors or, other societies, other kingdoms of the world, that they found themselves, much more powerful. So there was this temptation. Okay, we have this conflict within Europe. This constant conflict between, the French and the Germans and the Spaniards, and each one of these powers is much more powerful than those people in Latin America or Africa or much of Asia. So to actually to to strengthen ourselves vis-a-vis our competitors, let's establish colonies. The Brits have colonies. We need to have colonies too. And so again, there's just a very different logic that kicked in because of this unusual set of circumstances. And I think it led to that, at least in part, explains the expansionism. But historical circumstances eventually, unique historical circumstances come to an end. And I think that we're seeing that Europe today is finding, that none of that really applies anymore. First of all, they are not. They don't occupy that supreme position anymore. It seems like they still imagine it, like there's the ghost of it is there, but it's in reality it isn't there.
Yeah, I was reading about this just on a discussion forum on Zihu. They were talking about the Chinese netizens were talking about why is it that the Western countries, their empires or almost civilizations, they always end. Where where China, like you were saying, is that they're always the idea that it always reconstitutes, it rebuilds, and they have these cyclical dynastical periods but it's still always China. Their civilization doesn't end, their empire doesn't end. But it seems like in the West, it has this drive to, you can say, expand or create this empire to a point where it can't sustain itself and it collapses, and then that's it's just over, it's done, and then something completely new. It's not like it reconstitutes itself later. It's like, okay, we redraw the map and we'll try it again some other time. And it's just like I don't want to have to continue this pattern. I'm not saying that we have to do things the way the Chinese do it, but I want a civilizational path that doesn't have to constantly go through this path of empire, expansion, subjugation. Oh, we got too greedy, we got too evil, and then the whole thing falls apart, and then we go through this period of self-reflection maybe, and then do it again. What is this?
No. It's actually, I know that many scholars and writers, kind of look back on the Roman Empire, the fall of the Roman Empire as a tragedy. That maybe if it had survived like those attacks by the barbarians, we would have had a history more similar to China. Maybe we would have, and there were attempts to reconstitute it. There was the Holy Roman Empire, but it was only partially, just minimally successful. So we could have gone down a different course. Now, it's at the same time, there were beautiful things that were, there was this military competition and expansionism and colonialism. Of course, that's all very, very true. But there was also, a great flowering of Europe too. There is this extraordinary innovation and cultural, artistic creativity, and that's all there as well. It's hard to just, to simply, issue some kind of blanket judgment, on what's better or isn't. Now, the EU is looked at as some sort of possible, solution to the problem. And unfortunately, now who do we have? We have Ursula von der Leyen and Kaja Kallas in charge. You have these bureaucrats that just don't have any kind of vision, and just, they just seem to be very small-minded and again, just more concerned with their own power and maintaining their bureaucratic authority than anything else. So I think there were all kinds of people, across the political spectrum that had hope that the EU could maybe in a way become sort of like what the Roman Empire failed to be, and become what, like what China has succeeded in being in its own sphere. We just don't see it, but who knows? So that's part of what's, that's an interesting question. Like if the EU falls apart, well, we could go back, to that period of internecine warfare. It's just like all of a sudden the French will say, oh, the Germans are not being held in place by the Americans anymore. They're building up their arms. We know about the Germans. We've got to, prepare for war, and then we could see that all starting again. But maybe we'll have a more peaceful and amicable solution. But I don't think it's the EU. That's just not going to work.
Yeah, well, I imagine when this all collapses, that there will be this period of time where we all look around like, whoa, that was pretty stupid, guys, right? We really got to let things get out of hand. A lot of people are dead now, and everybody's broke. Why did we do that? And there'll be a period of self-reflection, and then maybe we can go through this period of humility, and then out of it is just some new renaissance where things come back. But the problem is that eventually we forget it. In the next 500 years, we find it like, oh man, look, now they're eating children again. How did we get off track? What did we do wrong? Like that.
Right. Well, again, it's like let's not fool ourselves too. I think, okay, Chinese history and the Chinese example, has much to offer and much to admire, but there was a lot of chaos and horrors, and it wasn't too long ago that we had the Cultural Revolution that was preceded by the Great Leap Forward, which may have resulted in the deaths, some people say, of up to 40 million people. There were these horrors that a unified government can inflict on its own people, and let's not forget that. And so it's just not, I don't know what the solution is. But the difference, of course, again, is that with China and I think to a lesser extent with Russia. Russia expanded, but in a very different way than the West expanded. I mean, again, it was sort of more in a more conservative way. Again, that like the Chinese, because the Chinese, it's not that they didn't expand at all; they expanded into Xinjiang, but it was like it was about preserving and strengthening their borders. And I think you can say the same is true in general of the Russians and then the Soviets after them. It was defensive. It wasn't about again seizing colonies overseas or whatever. That was a uniquely Western thing. But anyway, I forgot exactly the point I was going to make. But
I was just thinking about something you told me over a year ago in one of our earlier conversations. I was asking this question about like what's the best form of government, because it doesn't seem like democracy really works. And your answer I thought was very good. You said that it's really not the system of government or form of government so much. It's really about who is at the top, because no matter what government you have, there is always an elite class. There's always some type of ruling class. And now does that ruling class actually have the best interests of the people at heart? At the end of the day, that's truly what matters. And it's becoming clear to us now that the rulers of the West do not have the best interest of their people at heart. So what we need to just have is just to make sure that the only way that for us is that as people, we have to be vigilant and make sure that there are true mechanisms in place to show that these people are at the top are actually representing us. And they can't be co-opted. They can't be corrupted so easily. And it just, the problem is they just think, for me, the solution is just limited government, because once it gets too big, it just seems like it always gets co-opted. But I mean, obviously the Chinese, Russia, whatever, all these other countries that we view as so evil, maybe their system's not perfect and they do have a lot of power and the government's large and a lot of authority. But for the most part, I think they at least divert some of their energy to more helping out the regular people and trying to improve their country's status by increasing its income and the well-being of its people. So it's like you can have a big government that is actually working well for its people. But I just don't trust us. I just don't trust our ability,
Yeah. Well, that's unfortunately, it's true. I think the current ruling class, as I said, demented and depraved and, at very best, just stupid, those are the kind of people that we have in charge. Just look at them. Again, and our own people seem to be aware of it. I was looking at, there was an opinion poll of like approval ratings around the world, and in 8 of the top 10 were, let's say, the collective West. 8 of the top 10. Okay, but there were 2 BRICS nations. I think South Africa was number 5 with Ramaphosa, and then Lula number 10 in Brazil. Okay, but 8 of the top 10, and the top 3 were the UK, Keir Starmer, Merz in Germany, and Macron. I think he was, in fact, number 1 in France. These were the 3 most least approved of. So their own people, have the sense that there's something really, really wrong here. And yeah, that's the thing, is you can talk until you're blue in the face about systems of government and so on and so forth. But if the people at the top are some combination of depraved, demented, and stupid, nothing's going to work. And
right.
I don't see it. So it just seems like those people have to be replaced. And I hope it happens without bloodshed. That's all I can hope for. But I think those people just have to be replaced.
Yeah. It just, but we don't have a democracy. You know, I don't want to say like democracy has failed. It's just clearly what we have isn't democratic. If you say all these people that their populations don't approve of their leaders at all, well, democracy was supposed to solve that problem.
Right.
And so clearly what we have isn't democratic. If all the most democratic countries have the most hated leaders, then it's not working, you know?
Yeah. No, that's right. That's a problem. It really is. It shows that it isn't working. And we've seen, like, you know, all these people have played games to stay in power. You know, those leading parties, they play these games to actually prevent democracy from from succeeding within their countries. You know, for let's say, or put it this way, you know, prevent the popular will from really being implemented.
Yeah. Yeah. There's something about power and money that that's what I think one of the scary things about the Epstein file stuff is just the extent. And it's just like, man, I'm glad I didn't become a billionaire, because apparently it turns you into a horrible, horrible, horrible person. It just, I mean, it just seems to be across the board. I don't know what it is, how I mean, just the lack of integrity throughout the ultra wealthy, the elite, the so-called elite, you know, like what happened? How did they all, like, didn't any of them have a conscience, or like, how did this happen? You know, it's
right.
It blows my mind. It's just this conformity. And we talked about this actually on our members only video once, just that I think it starts with the education, this idea of conforming to an ideology. And that's how you get in the group. And, you know, you go to these elite colleges and then you get your job, and then it's just, you inhabit that world. You learn to shut your brain off to think critically or morally, ethically. It's just like, no, this is how the system works, and I'm part of it, and that allows me to be a good person and do good things. But I just have to, you know, sacrifice this child, and then I'll be okay. You know, that's how it feels like. It's pretty crazy. Okay, I think we can end it there, Dad.
Sure.
Okay. All right.
Why not?
Why not? Good place to end it. All right. Have a good rest of your day and a great weekend. I'll talk to you soon.
Okay.
All right. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.